So this case involving Suzanne Simpson has been at the forefront of headlines across the city as well as even across the country. Um, how can somebody be charged with murdering somebody that might not even be legally dead? Is there a difference?
So it is harder to charge somebody with murder if you can't prove that somebody is dead. And in Texas, that can be difficult to do, but it can be done through circumstantial evidence.
How does that differ from the criminal legal process? Circumstantial evidence shows that somebody is dead, but I guess absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So how does somebody go about proving that?
You can prove that somebody's dead if you have sufficient circumstances in a criminal context to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they're deceased. So, for example, if there was so much of their blood found at a scene that there's no way they could live, then you would be able to prove that they were deceased, even though you had no direct evidence, such as a body or a video of somebody being murdered.
Now, for estate purposes, say Suzanne has assets, whether they be in the bank or property or things of this nature. We saw last week that they're cleaning out the house and preparing to eventually sell the house in Almost Park that they lived in. How are they able to do that if she's not legally dead? And how does somebody get declared legally dead for those purposes?
I mean, it's a good question. How do you sell somebody's property if you haven't had them declared legally dead and you don't have the right to do that for somebody who is still presumed to be alive? In Texas, you need to wait 7 years after somebody is reported missing before it's presumed that they might be deceased. Even then, you would have to go to a probate court and request what are called letters testamentary or an administration of the estate. That is, you would have to get the court to essentially declare them dead and open a probate process, which can be done through circumstantial evidence to the court's satisfaction. What satisfies a particular court is going to vary, but it's usually a very high standard.
So with this criminal case, let's just operate in I guess things that we don't know have happened yet. Um, let's just say Brad Simpson is found not guilty of any sort of homicidal offenses. How does this impact that determination?
Well, if Brad Simpson was found guilty of murder, that would be a pretty strong legal circumstance to indicate that Suzanne Simpson was deceased. And that might get a probate court to open probate and declare her dead prior to the 7 year window, or make it much easier after 7 years. But even if a probate court declared Suzanne Simpson dead, the estate couldn't be closed and the assets couldn't be disposed of for another 3 years under Texas law.
Explain that.
So, under Texas law, where a court has declared someone dead, there's still a waiting period before the estate can be closed of 3 years. And that means that while something called letters testamentary or an administration can be provided, that would be to mostly to handle ongoing issues such as taxes or debts that need to be paid. Larger assets typically would not be disposed of for another 3 years, and the estate would have to stay open because we want to be sure before we sell off all of somebody's stuff or give it away that they are in fact dead.
And so how does this impact it? Say she had a life insurance policy. Does this not get paid out until the conclusion of the criminal case? Are you aware of any sort of vehicles to get around that?
So some assets called non-probate assets might be disposed of sooner if somebody hasn't been declared dead. If the insurance company on a life insurance policy accepts that somebody is dead for their own reasons, they can disperse the funds. That's going to be really rare, though, because life insurance companies don't want to accidentally pay out a bunch of their own money to the wrong person or when somebody might still be alive. And so generally, even these non-probate assets are going to be tied up until somebody is declared dead by a probate court.
So I mean, taking into consideration cases that I can't think of the last time the DA has taken a case without a body, but this just doesn't really happen. So how does something like this unique situation usually play out, if you can say? I mean,
So usually when we have a missing person and we can't easily and directly prove that they're deceased, this just takes a really long time, and it's very complicated for the family members. The IRS is not very sympathetic most of the time. They want taxes to be paid, and even if that person can't be found and is thought to be deceased, somebody needs to pay the taxes, or assets can be attached, including homes or property. So it's really just a very difficult process for the family. And even proving a circumstantial case to a probate court is difficult. You have to give notice to the missing person, which is difficult. So people will be required to put notices in newspapers and on the courthouse and send notices to their email accounts and last known address, even though we don't think that they're there. Often private investigators are required to go show that they've looked everywhere for someone. What you're looking at really is a 10-year period before most people who are missing can be declared dead and have their estate settled. And although it's uncommon that we have people just go missing, that's the process, because there are people who go missing for their own reasons, start a new life somewhere. And we have a recent example of that in a case where somebody faked their own death on a lake in a kayak and then apparently has fled to Eastern Europe. So, the people left behind after somebody goes missing are in for a tough haul. And it's going to affect all of them. It's the uncertainty of knowing where they are, but it's also still being responsible for a lot of their finances without the power to actually handle those finances. And it's just brutal.
so if you will help me speculate here, how has the family been able to effectively move stuff out of the house and sell things and prepare to sell the house if both Suzanne and Brad the are on the title? That doesn't track with me.
I mean, I'm speculating a little bit here, but I don't see any cases related to this matter which would allow them to do that. I suspected they're moving things out because nobody has said no. They may face legal repercussions down the line, particularly because Mr. Simpson has an ownership right in a lot of what the couple owned together. So I think the family needs to be very careful about what they're taking. There are situations where if something is owned solely by a missing person and is not joint or community property under Texas law, a family member might be able to do that, particularly if they had a power of attorney or some other legal document giving them some authority to dispose of somebody's property. But where it's joint or community property, they need the consent of both people. And to my knowledge, Mr. Simpson hasn't provided any consent for that. So I think that they're on very shaky legal ground. I certainly understand their need for closure, but they really want to do this in consultation with an attorney.
So technically, even though Suzanne has disappeared and Brad is in jail, they would still need both parties to consent to selling and all of this stuff in the house.
Most household items are going to be joint property, but like a gift, for example, a wedding ring or, a pet, those might be separate property. And a family member with a power of attorney would have the legal authority to go dispose of that property. But in a marriage in Texas, most property is presumed to be community property, and you really need the consent of at least one person to do anything with it, ideally both. You can't, for example, sell a house owned by two people without both of their signatures. So again, I would never advise a client to just go take stuff out of a house on behalf of a missing person without going through some legal steps first. Um, because the only thing that's going to make all of this worse is getting sued by the person that you think murdered your daughter or sister or mom.
So I technically, if Brad were to say, okay, yes, you can sell the house, they would still need Suzanne to say, yes, that's cool too.
Yeah, even if Brad gave them permission to sell the house, it would be difficult for them to get clean title for a sale without joinder of both owners' signatures. So a lot of title companies just aren't going to be interested in touching that. And that's going to make it very difficult. But people do make sales of real estate without title companies, although lawyers don't advise that for a lot of reasons. And they might be able to clear up the title later. But yeah, that's just going to be very difficult because let's say she reappeared later and the Texas law provides for this, she would have the legal right to obtain back most of her property if she can. So nobody wants to buy a home under those circumstances where 10 years later, somebody might pop back up and take it back.
Any thoughts on this front? Just having seen all of it play out. I mean, you're very close to the Alamo Heights or Olmos Park community, and those two communities, Olmos Park and Alamo Heights, really, you know, commingle or bleed into each other, if you will. Just any thoughts on how this has all played out so far?
You know, what's different here is that everyone involved has the resources to have good legal advice and has access to attorneys. And also, probably more importantly, to counselors who can help them process their grief. Often, when people are in limbo because somebody's missing, we don't know what happened to them. They're both grieving and angry and confused, and they just feel like they need to do something, but that's not the right frame of mind to be in to start doing things because you don't want to make yourself vulnerable to somebody that you think has wronged your family. And you don't want to get yourself in legal trouble if you want to be part of a prosecution of that person.
So you're familiar with this process of I guess probating an estate uh, with a deceased individual who is near and dear to you.
Yeah, my mom disappeared when my sister and I were young. It was a cold case for 30 years until I became an attorney and gave DNA, and we were able to locate her remains and find out some of what happened. But we went through this process, and it's a huge ordeal. You know, my dad needed to go get the declaration of death in order to pay taxes, dispose of property, do all of those kinds of things. Um, but it was a hard day when he came to my sister and I and said, "Look, I'm going to have your mom declared dead." And it's difficult for the family. There are some people who may not want to believe it. There's going to be other people who are absolutely wanting to move on. And then there's going to be people who have moved on. And this is just going to reopen that wound for them. So I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for the Simpson family, for everybody who knows Suzanne Simpson. And it's part of the reason that I'm warning them to seek good legal advice and to seek counselors to help process their grief because a misstep at this stage can make the grief worse and make things take a lot longer. The goal here, once people are emotionally ready to accept that they have lost a loved one, and we believe that that's the case, is to try and get closure and move on. And you don't want to do things that are just going to keep reopening that wound over and over for a decade or more.
And what should anybody do in this situation?
I'm really hoping that they have a power of attorney and that there is somebody who can at least do some things, but a power of attorney gives people authority to dispose of different legal issues or assets. It doesn't overcome community property and it doesn't overcome probate law. So their hands are probably really tied. And that's the unfortunate thing. But until we know that somebody's dead, until the evidence is sufficient to prove that they are dead, especially circumstantially, when we don't have a body, it's a tough legal process because we can't just run around declaring people dead because nobody's heard from them for a while. I mean, you can see how that could be taken advantage of by bad actors. So right now they don't have a lot of options. And I think what they should focus on, if they can, is just taking care of each other. They are going to need help and support from their friends, and they're going to need to support each other and try to make a conscious decision not to let this tear them apart. Because right now, when they're in limbo and they're clutching at straws, it's real easy to make decisions that are going to hurt later.
And your mother was found, you said 30 years after her disappearance. Um, and that came as a result of obviously your continuation of pressing this case. Talk to me about that.
You know, DNA technology had advanced in the 30 years since my mother's death. And they were able to match my DNA to remains that were held. And we realized that actually her remains had been discovered a long time before that. It's just that the coroners made a mistake and didn't identify her properly. I really appreciate the medical examiner in Harris County who eventually picked up the case, apologizing to us and helping us lay her to rest. But that's one of the problems that you have, even where somebody is deceased and we just don't know it. Is some families never get closure, and we were very lucky. And I was in a good position to be able to help as an attorney, and we had good law enforcement who were willing to work with us, and in fact, actively helping us, from the district attorney in the county where she was found to SAPD to folks out in Houston. But even with all of that help, it wasn't for 3 decades that we were able to figure out what happened to her. And by that point, most of us had made our peace with it. So it was great to be able to lay her to rest, but we'd all figured out a way to cope with her disappearance well before then. And the Simpson family doesn't have to wait. They should engage in that process now, because the longer you go without that resolution, I think the harder it is to try to find some kind of peace for yourself.